The food service and hospitality industries are evolving, often in ways you've never heard of, until now. Our host and technovator, Rob Grimes, is the leading voice of global food service and hospitality technology. Powered by the International Food and Beverage Technology Association, IFBTA, the Accelerate podcast is where technology and ideas are shared, served with a side of new innovation. Welcome to the Accelerate podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Accelerate podcast powered by the IFBTA. I'm Rob Grimes, your host, and this week we're going to be discussing, immortality and how that might impact the hospitality industry. But before we do that, let me recap some key points from the last episode, which was actually the second part of the first part, talking about top tech lists. And first we had focused on those lists which are in fact the industry cousins, so to speak. But part two was taking a look at industry influencers. And we started with talking about futurists and what they predict for the future, because they sort of set in your mind's eye what it is we need to be thinking about. But then we talked about those places with unlimited research and development funds, the military, healthcare, education. And we concluded with where inspiration and ideas come from in general, once they've been put into our heads. We reviewed the top 10 lists, or the top lists for each area of the three that get the funding and the research, and then we look for commonality, as we did with our industry cousins. All that wrapped up in a bow to try to give us a perspective between part one and part two of how to think about the future and what we might want to think are going to be the trends for 2024, but the trends that are developing trends in 2024, but then leading as those building blocks that we've talked about before for the future. Well, what about today? Tech immortality. So what does that mean? Or what was the inspiration behind that? Well, maybe it might be, or using tech to become immortal. And as I think about it, what does immortality mean? And how do we resurrect or recreate things of the past to make them immortal? Sometimes they're in our minds, sometimes they're otherwise, but perhaps they can become reality again. And even bringing back things that are long gone. Well, I got to be honest with you. I thought about this as I was touring a very famous graveyard outside of Boston. And I've always said how interesting it would be to visit an old graveyard, and this was a very old one from the 1800s, look at the headstones, and then look up the people behind them. And this graveyard has probably close to 100,000 people in it, going back into the 1800s. And so I did exactly that. Not just necessarily looking at the biggest shrine or the biggest tombstone or statue or whatever it was, but looking at some of the things that were said on the tombstones about that person's life. And in some cases, because I have my phone with me, I went ahead and Googled it and said, oh, okay, who is this person? What did they do? Came across, especially with some of the big statues and the big monuments, people whose companies or whatever it was are still around. And you start to paint a picture. What was their family? Especially because there were a lot of crypts there with multiple people buried in them. But it starts to give you an idea of their life, but then you can look them up, and basically what I was thinking is you can bring them back to life. Well, let's go ahead and take a step further, because I went down that rabbit hole, and I started to think about immortality, and I think about my own mortality in there. And products like Ancestry that I got hooked on several Christmas holiday breaks ago, and I still use from time to time. But the amount of information that was available was out there. Then I think about iconic brands. And I think about technology that is being used today to take a look and cover the past. And one of them was my very first podcast on the Accelerate show, was with Storyfile and with Stephen Smith. And he had done something called the Shoah Project, which was to record the life stories of Holocaust survivors before they passed away. And Ancestry does that. And we start thinking about those things that were lost, those people, those stories that were lost during COVID, all those stories and people that just disappeared. And we had to see them digitally and put together their stories because you couldn't visit them in person. We have industry icons, famous restaurants, famous chefs, favorite recipes. Some have been lost, and some have been out there in cookbooks. And we see them getting glamorized when we take a look at what James Beard does, and we take a look at famous chefs and the French Chef. I mean, the movies on that. There's a lot of characters, I might say, in the industry. They're not all chefs. A lot of characters. Very hard to recreate a character, and people that came up with different cooking. Like, who knew? I went to a seminar this past week, and who knew that different companies are credited with coming up with different kinds of foods? Occasionally, we see that on the Food Channel, and people take claim, to coming up with a certain type of hot dog, the first hot dog that was sold. Or, I learned that, different other items that have become very famous were created by famous restaurateurs or famous brands, and they're out there forever. And a lot of times they still have their name on them, but it's just very interesting to me. And we don't want to lose those things. And then we also lose not only what the Show Up Project showed us and the idea of being able to record your ancestors or record loved ones before they pass away and tell their story, but I start to think about the ability to piece together everything that is in the cloud, all those videos, all those pictures, all those sound bites, and put those things together. Where might that take us? My own school classes, when I went to hospitality school at Penn State, and Penn State, like many other hospitality schools, have programs where you have to create. And in one of the classes I took, we had to recreate famous meals at famous restaurants, no longer around. But we had to be able to research and look up their menus, what the recipes are, the style of service, the uniforms, the decor, to put it all together. And of course, we have many famous ones like that. By the way, we have famous ones that never existed too, that become famous because maybe they were, in a movie or something like that. And all of a sudden, it seems like a great thing to create a brand around. We've seen that happen as well, too. We've talked about the cookbooks. And just plain old nostalgia. I have and go to the Jersey Shore, and I have memories of certain restaurants that don't exist. And every time to time, I look them up. Where did they exist? What's there now? What about those menus? And then I find out that some of their signature menu items, in fact, may be served by somebody else. We've certainly seen that also in the hotel industry, recreating famous hotels or rooms and themes. And so, again, I guess it's an interesting inspiration or got me thinking, but I couldn't stop thinking about all weekend. So I figured, you know what? Let's have this discussion, on Accelerate. And so the idea is, can tech provide a solution to iconic brands and hospitality to avoid their death and have them live on? And that's really the question. So where do the universes collide? Where do they intersect? What are these opportunities, in fact? Well, we certainly have famous iconic brands. And there's even some companies out there that are called iconic brands, or famous brands that are out there where they're recreating or bringing back those things. And when I talked about COVID, brands were lost during COVID. And each year for a couple of years, I was looking at sort of like when you watch the Academy Awards or the Grammys and they talk about who we lost over the last year. They were talking about well-known restaurants that have been around for ages, third, fourth, fifth generations, that went by the wayside and are no more. And that happens quite a bit. That happens quite a bit in the family restaurants that we have generational ones where there isn't somebody to take over. There's no interest. But the idea is there. We also have brands that are lost when there are acquisitions or when things don't come together and they're not able to operate the way they did or the way we remember. Or it's hard to recreate that culture, that environment that's out there. So certainly famous brands are one way. But immortality also exists in the creator of the brand or the thought. It could be a chef. It could be, it could be a Julia Childs, which certainly was recreated on television. We see documentaries on this. It certainly can be the entrepreneur that comes up with a great idea. But what happens when they're gone? Or what happens when they sell out? Do we lose what it was that made it special, their idea behind it? And that's something that tech can provide immortality to people who are no longer with us, or they're out of the business, but we want their vision, their message, their culture, their communications to continue. Certainly, recipes have found their way that way. The challenge with recipes is we find them in books. Maybe we have people that recreate them, but it's very hard to have that chef teach you that recipe because it isn't as matter and interpret it the way that they interpreted it and how they came up with it and what their vision was behind a recipe or why things were put together. If you can't talk directly to that chef and hear what it was that brought it all together, what did they want you to see and smell and taste, together? Perhaps also with the environment. We've seen some very famous chef movies like that and that culture that's out there because it's really the overall experience that puts together the food and how it looks and its taste and its texture and its environment. So recipes are there. Environments, famous environments. You think about Hello Dolly and the famous steakhouse there. We've seen them created. You go to Disney and you can see many things created that just sort of came out of the movies. Very famous coffee shops, like the ones of the 50s that were out there, the 50s diners that were iconic. Mel's Diner that maybe didn't exist in real life, but it was after something. So we see those environments that are recreated from the old to the new. Sometimes those environments also go by the wayside, and sometimes they come back around. Technology can help us to do that. I've been reading some articles recently about the old automats that used to be in New York and how those automats don't exist anymore. I remember going there as a kid to the Kraft automat with my grandmother, and they don't exist anymore. Yet I read articles in the last 2 to 3 weeks that talk about the new automats with hot and cold lockers and pickup. That's technology actually bringing back the automat. Now, the question is the rest of the environment there looking that way? I'm not sure. But I went into a cooking store over the weekend, several of them over the last few weeks, looking at equipment and what's coming back, that old-looking cooking, old bottles of Coke or Pepsi that people are serving at banquets. And I went to a wedding that had that. So the old styles, the retro styles are back. And so people take a look at that and we want to recreate that, but we can recreate the whole picture, the whole essence, the whole experience by using technology and culture and personality for sure. And you've heard me talk about how I believe that the lack of communications is changing the culture of a business between the original founder and the employees and explaining why it is, because it gets watered down over time and a manual just doesn't do it and a video just doesn't do it. But being able to talk to the entrepreneur, the chef, the person, and understand their thinking and their vision, even if they're long gone. Being able in a Walmart to talk to Sam Walton and hear what it was. Or iconic brands in our industry, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, people who came up with things, Norm Brinker, and certainly on the hotel side, being able to do that. So we're able to put the personality and culture back into the business. But again, so much is stored online and available, especially over the last, let's say, 50 years, from audio, video, presentations, that it can be pieced together. And then using other technologies, which we're going to talk about in the second half here, how do we put it together? So hopefully I made the case from going from the grave to back out of the grave in our industry and the opportunities are available for immortal hospitality and using tech to get there. So I'm not sure what the title is there, but immortal hospitality or tech to become immortal or tech immortality as it relates to the hospitality industry. But we have a great opportunity in front of us. So we're going to talk about that in the second half of this podcast today. And before we do, if you have cool ideas, if you're visiting a cemetery, if you see that automat, you get the inspiration the same as I do. It doesn't matter if it's work, if it's within our industries, or you're just walking around with your family as I was doing, and it just makes you say, wow, or it makes you think. Take that picture. Make a video, send a link, or just pass it on directly to me at coolideas@robertgrimes.com, because it does help us to start a thinking process, a conversation where we can explore, learn, and share together. And they find their way like this into an Accelerate episode as well. And speaking of Accelerate, to subscribe, or if you have any thoughts, comments, or suggestions, please send us a note to accelerate@savor.fm, SAVOR.fm. And our producer will take a look at and pass on your comments, thoughts, and subscribe you, sign you up, and make you immortal within our podcast and our subscriber base. Well, I think I put the idea out there, and you can see where my mind was at. Maybe I'm getting older, so I'm just thinking that way. But we got to connect the dots here. We got to put it together. And so I've said for a long time that if we look at the future, which was the subject of the last two shows, we're looking at those things that change, where technology is the enabler and able to make them change. The food, the people, the experience, the environment. Those are all the different aspects of hospitality. But what we've said is at the center of hospitality is compassion. And at the center of hospitality is our ability to feel and to relate and to give feedback and interact with the guests, with our employees, and with our stakeholders. And that is where, if you want to be immortal, you need to be able to bring that back, and we need to be able to take each of those pieces and put them together, and technology can help us to do that. Now, if you start at the top to deliver hospitality before you even get to the guests, because you just can't recreate it. I guess you can recreate it. You can recreate it, and you can put it on a grocery store shelf, and it can be in a food tray or whatever it's going to be. I guess you could do that. But that's not delivering the whole package. That's just delivering the food and something that people see. And that is a way that things live on, by the way. These brands go for going into the packaged goods. They find somebody to produce the favorite recipes, put it on the grocery shelf, and yes, you can bring it home and enjoy it as you would in the restaurant. But I'm looking at how do we make our hospitality operations immortal through technology. And it's got to start with the employees and the stakeholders, those that run, those that manage, those that work. So we've already talked about the connecting points on that side, which is we have to connect the communications and the culture. We have to provide what the vision is and what the background is so people understand the why. What makes things different? What is the differentiation? And we can do that through products that are able to record that history, to show us how it's supposed to run, show us how it's delivered, show us what the uniforms look like, what the plating should look like, almost everything, I guess, except for the food itself. And we can do that, but at the same time, people need to understand the why, the vision, the background, and the culture. And we can recreate that, and we can use technology to explain it to them, have them ask questions using generative AI and some of the other tools available to us, that library in the sky, the cloud library, and we can do that. But from the guest food, from the guest view, we've talked about many different things. So if we're going to recreate a brand or make it immortal, and we start with the food, we have the recipes. Now, I would think about this because sometimes the recipes, getting the recipe right and how it's cooked, there's enough information out there today digitally that we can see it, especially from some of the special TV programs that we see out there and the iconic pieces that are out there where they've recreated it. We can see what it looks like. We can read the recipes, and we can go ahead and put that together. But we need to put it together in a style and in a format that people see, they recognize, and is part of the brand and part of that vision and part of that culture. We can recreate the food even if the building blocks of the food, the ingredients, are no longer around or they've changed over time because of technologies like the plant-based technologies and genetic engineering of foods. We, in fact, can create and recreate the food and the taste the way they were. We can do that analysis and we can create the taste the way it was. We can also create the food in such a way that we have the same portion sizes, that we have the same feeling of satisfaction, that same taste, the same texture. We can take care of the food using technology, and we can recreate it. And we can recreate it so you can take it home, or we can recreate it in your home, and we can show you how to cook it. So then you have the people. Well, the people are the way that we provide the experience. So we've talked about all kinds of experience things, but that is the people understanding why they're there, being able to tell the story, being able to display the foods. I mean, I remember being able to display foods before you would pick them in a steakhouse. You know, being the uniforms, we can recreate that as well. So then you have the environment. Now, here's the interesting thing about environment. Environment today doesn't necessarily have to be a single place, a single time. We recreate these environments all the time in augmented reality and headsets, but we now start to see the walls, which I've talked about, which can recreate the look and feel of a room. And you can do the furniture, and you can build an environment on demand to create whatever environment you want. The old style, the new style. You can make a digital menu board look like a chalkboard if you want to. So we can use technology to recreate the environment, including how the menus are done. There's any number of ways that we can do that. But all of this, the food, the people, the service, it's really not the people, it's the service styles that we do. And the environment are put together to create an overall experience. The question is, can we use technology to recreate that experience without having to recreate and rebuild the walls? And the answer is yes. So if we take a look at that, I don't want to just say what we can and can't do, and I don't want to just put those questions out there. I want to have that conversation about how do you put technology to work to bring to life or re-bring to life, resurrect the concept, the brand, the food, the chef. Well, I started by telling you the very first episode of this podcast in Accelerate that I did was with a company called Storyfile, and I told you their background. Well, I am very well aware that we have icons in the industry that have been recreated once they've been dead, whether it's famous music icons or whatever, that have been out there, or chefs, because there's so much video and there's so much information available that we really can, in fact, recreate that universe and make it seem as if they're alive. Because through technologies like AI, ChatGPT, art, you can recreate and create new information based upon the history of information that's available on that recipe, on that person, on that look, on that feel, on the story. Ancestry has been a very good place to find documents. If you can do it and find the old boat manifests of somebody who came over in the 1700s, or you can find the birth certificates, you can certainly find the old menus, you can find the design, the diagrams, you can find the writings. You can certainly find all those things online because somewhere, somehow, those archives have been digitized. The old photographs, the old pictures. Search any subject you want, you're going to find it. If it exists out there, it has been digitized. But more and more, everything, let's say, for the last 20 years has been digitized because of the use of cell phones and cameras and recording devices that we carry with us. So because of that, we're digitizing everything. And those once digital pieces really never disappear. And even if there's a copyright on them, I suppose, for a period of time, or a personal copyright when you're gone, those things are going to be available. And so I see us building that digital world and rebuilding those things using the digital piece. The immersive tech is already out there to recreate the environment, the look of the room. Feel like you're in your room at home, your kitchen at home, or in a famous restaurant or a kitchen, or feel like you're in the same environment as other people who are in another place. The cooking methods and devices we've talked about can help to ensure that we get it right all the time. The devices that we're now seeing that are ovens that go to the internet to get the recipe to cook something perfectly, or they know what you've put in the oven to cook it perfectly every time, the same way the chef would, no mistakes. So you can do it at home. You could do it in a restaurant, a pop-up. Those are things in technology that bring things to life after the person is gone. Certainly, the recipes online are there that you can go ahead and build the recipe, go shopping for the recipe, know what kinds of items you have to put together. And I covered this a couple years ago at CES, having a scale to go ahead and make sure you're properly measuring and doing it right. I always make mistakes trying to convert that stuff when I'm doing cooking and I'm trying to follow a recipe. It's almost like no fault cooking using technology in measurement, in weight, in quality, in temperature. All of those technologies help to ensure that we're able to get the same product that we would have gotten somewhere else or we could have gotten in the past that is no longer available. But on top of that, we can also tailor and texture it for our own health and lifestyle and calories and things. So I could get the same item that was on a menu 50 years ago or 100 years ago that was heavy in fat and still get that same texture and taste, but keeping my calories and health in mind. That would also bring us to things like the interactive training personalization, just like the chefs. So certainly by the use of cameras, and we'll see where the cameras go in the eyeglasses, but you can actually have an instructor that you don't have to go to the class. You can be in your own kitchen instructing you how to make the item correctly, just like the chefs, but you're doing it at home. The measurement, we talked about the health. But I also believe that long-term, the printing of foods on demand or cooking techniques, and I talk about this a lot of episodes, things like sous vide, allow us to get something that's partially prepared and finish it off without burning it, without doing it wrong, by putting it in a device that knows what it is, that's going to cook it right every time. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the chef. But a lot of times people don't want to sell their recipes and their food outside of their operations because they're concerned of the quality and how it's going to taste, and it's not going to be right. Well, I think that concern in today's world can go away. But then I do believe that over time, we will cook desserts and things, cook, print on demand, through the printing of foods, which we know is coming, to be able to prepare it at home using other types of materials than the raw ingredients that may have been available or not available today or not available where we are. I think if we put all this together, you can see how we could take an existing environment, whether it's a recipe, a chef, the location itself, the story behind it, the hotel room, the retail store, the clothing, the style, the culture, how we can recreate things of the past, but using modern tools can go ahead and recreate in such a way that our ancestors and those that came up with them would be proud. And that makes us proud also, not just as the consumer and the guest, but it makes us proud as well as the employee and the person working in the environment. Because I don't have to sit there and say anymore that, boy, things have changed from when I went to work at a place, that now they're different. I can say that culture and style is still the same, and I can share that with others, and I can explain, why did I go to work in that place in the first place? What was it that got me excited? Who did I want to train under? Who did it right? Who are my mentors? As a matter of fact, virtual mentoring is probably going to be, part of this as well, because of everything that is available in tech today. Each of the building blocks of hospitality, food, people, environment, experience, culture, communications, the entrepreneurship, the differentiation, none of it has to go away. And therefore, we can create concepts today that become immortal, even if the bricks and mortar changes, or how we have to deliver it, or it's a vending machine, or it's in space, or whatever has to change. And we can recreate those memories we had in the past without having to go through all the cost to be able to do that, but being able to get it right, where people say, this isn't how I remember it, maybe making it exactly how you remember it. And by the way, this does apply at home, because you always have those memories of how your mother used to make something, and you have those memories just as I do. And, you can never seem to get it right. Well, maybe we can get it right going forward, including, as Julia Childs, was showing, and those cookbooks live on, how to make things the way she would have made them, because it's all available to us today. So I hope that gives us the when, why, and how. The when is now. The why is because we have memories and we love the things of the past, and some of them are just so great we want to have them forever. And the how, using technology to make it happen. And that's for sure. This podcast is brought to you by the International Food and Beverage Technology Association. The IFBTA is the industry's voice of technology within food and beverage, providing thought leadership as a single, impartial, and go-to resource. The IFBTA offers in-person and online communities to connect with your peers, the exchange an all-encompassing global technology directory, and an industry-wide professional education and certification program. The bottom line is the IFBTA is your place to gather, learn, and share. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Accelerate, powered by the IFBTA. I'm Rob Grimes, your host, and I look forward to our next accelerated conversation together.